Hello, everyone. Russ of Aquarimax here, and I am here with Joe Wilson, and I'm going to let him introduce himself.
Hey, guys. So I'm Joe Wilson. I'm a biology professor at Utah State University. I study a lot of things, but specifically I'm interested in bees and wasps, and my favorite wasp is the velvet ant. Even though it doesn't sound like a waspy name, velvet ants are wingless wasps, and so today that's what we get to talk about.
Yep, I'm really excited to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have in common a fascination with velvet ants, so that's awesome.
We do, and not many people do, right? Not many people know what they are.
Right, but a lot of people on in the chat here actually do. So we're going to open it up to them in just a minute and start taking some of their questions. So welcome, everybody. I see in the house so far, we've got Ridgewick and Armadillidium vulgare, Licinius, the Kingdom of Animals, Mystery Finn, the Anonymous Toucan, iBugman, Brand's Pet Paradise, Crystals, Pets and Plants, Supreme Gecko, and Jordan Safala. Hello. Oh, there's Ken Malinsky too. Awesome. So I'm sure we'll get a lot more people in the house as well, but I wanted to open it up to our Patreon questions. They sent in a few questions, so we're going to hit those first. And everyone, welcome, and we're going to focus on velvet ants as well as other bee and wasp questions if you have them today. So if you can try to keep your questions there, those are the ones I'm going to hit first. Okay, so welcome, welcome, welcome. And here we go. The first question we have from our Patreon backers is from Ken of the Kaiju ISO channel. And he is asking, when you're searching in the wild for velvet ants, will you find them alone? Are they solitary, or do they nest in groups communally?
That's a great question. So velvet ants are officially solitary. There's not a lot of social interaction between them except for mating. But because many bees and wasps that they parasitize nest in groups, so often a bee or a wasp will find a kind of a habitat that it likes to nest in, and many of them will nest in close proximity, kind of like a neighborhood. Because that happens, sometimes you will find velvet ants parasitizing this neighborhood of ground nesting bees and wasps. So they are solitary, but if you find one, there's a good chance there's another one kind of close by, because it means there's some hosts nearby.
Okay, so not truly social, but at the same time, they're taking advantage of a social species, and so you get numbers of them.
Yeah, so I wonder if we should take a step back and talk about velvet ant biology a little bit. Maybe there's some questions about that, but it might be a good starting point. Is that all right?
Yeah, let's do it.
So velvet ants, we know, are wasps. We now know that they're solitary wasps, but they look like big hairy ants because the female velvet ants don't have any wings. And velvet ants are parasites. They're actually called a parasitoid, but they're a parasitic wasp. So the velvet ant's life as an adult female is wandering around looking for a nest of their host. Most velvet ants parasitize ground nesting bees or wasps. So they'll crawl around, and if you get lucky enough to see one close up, you'll see its antennas are tapping the ground all the time. Their antennas tap the ground and their abdomen taps the ground. And they have these chemical sensing cells that they're looking for the smells of a ground nesting bee or wasp. They'll then dig into that nest and lay an egg on the pupa or the larva of that ground nesting bee or wasp, and then the baby velvet ant, the larval velvet ant, eats the larval bee or wasp. So they're not nice guys of the wasp world, but they're super cool.
They are. Yeah, I love them. So yeah, that's a good introduction to velvet ants for those who are wondering. A lot of times people will point out, they'll say to me when I'm talking about velvet ants, but they're really wasps, right? And yes, they are. We just call them velvet ants as a common name, as you mentioned. They're actually, wasp is an important thing to remember as we're talking about them. So PSM asks, again from Patreon, how do the female velvet ants make nests in the ground since they can't fly? And do the males make them up high like other wasps?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So with almost all bee, wasps, and ants, the males don't really participate in nest building or in any nesting activity. So generally the males will mate with the female, and then they're done with their life, basically. So it's interesting because female Hymenoptera, bees, wasps, and ants, they can actually store the sperm alive in a little pouch they have. So they mate once right when they emerge, and then they can carry that sperm around for months and months and use it when they want to. So the females, they don't really make a home nest since they're parasitic. They're just searching for the nest of other Hymenoptera. And then the males, once they've mated, they just kind of fly around, drink nectar from flowers, and they don't live very long. They live a couple of weeks. The females generally live several months, maybe even a year in some cases. But yeah, the males don't participate at all in nest building.
Okay, excellent answer to the question there. Now, actually, PSM had another question that you kind of answered, which was how long do they live?
And it's a lot of it's up in the air because we don't know the biology for all the species, but there has been at least one species that has been kept alive in the lab for 18 months, so a year and a half. Other species probably only live about a month.
Okay.
As an adult, it's kind of tricky because most of their life is as a larva underground waiting for the next summer to come.
Right. So it's hard to say how long they're living. There could be times when they're essentially in diapause during winter, something like that.
Yeah, most of their life is probably in diapause underground waiting for the hot summer months.
Okay. So I have a question from Supreme Gecko, the first velvet ant question that I've noticed. Supreme Gecko says, is it possible then to breed and raise young velvet ants in captivity?
You know, I would love to be able to do that, and I'm hoping Russ can learn how to do that for me. I'm counting on you. So we've been able to keep them in the lab for a long time, but we can't get them to, not only can we not get them to breed, most of the time when you collect them, they've already mated, so that female has that sperm stored in her pouch, but we can't get them to parasitize things in the lab. I did read one dissertation from somebody in the 70s that was able to get some parasitic activity to happen, but we haven't been able to rear out new velvet ants. So they're all just wild caught that we use in the lab so far.
Okay. Yeah. And did you say in that paper they were able to get them to lay eggs, but then they couldn't get them to, they couldn't complete the life cycle?
So I think they actually laid eggs and got a next generation, but then they couldn't get them to like mate and continue the next. So what they did is they actually they went out and collected sand wasp pupa that you can just sift out of the sand, and they put that into a box and put like glass slides over over that sand wasp pupa, and they got the velvet ants to kind of dig underneath the glass slide and parasitize it. But I've never heard of that happening again before or after that. So it's not something that's easy to do, but maybe one of you guys will figure it out. And if you do, let me know, because I'd love to see what happens.
Oh yeah. Yeah. That would be great. And I want to try it. And that, did you say that was Dasymatilla biloculata they tried that with?
I believe so. I can't remember right now, but I think so, which is a pretty common one actually across the country.
Mm-hmm. And I can get that species right in the hills behind my house. So that would be one to try then.
Yeah.
If we can get that going.
That'd be really cool.
Cool. So Bug Slayer, is asking, are there any velvet ants that would be in Mesquite, Nevada or in the area, because I'm traveling there?
Oh, there's tons. So this time of year is actually really prime velvet ant collecting time of year. The tricky part is they live in different spots. So I often will go to sandy areas, and in the early evening, so maybe after about 6 o'clock, 6 or 7 o'clock, so it was starting to cool off a little bit. It's really good if there's kind of monsoonal moisture around, so there's clouds around in the area, but it's not raining. And so then I just walk around on sandy trails. Cow trails work well, or dirt roads, and I watch for them walking around. I actually did collect some near Mesquite earlier this year, but it was a sand dune specialist species.
Cool. I looked out today and noticed that it was cloudy and not really raining. And I thought, tonight after I record videos, I might go out and look for some.
I thought the same thing. It was like 60% humidity, which is odd for Utah. But it's definitely a good day for velvet ants. Yeah.
So maybe we'll both be out there today.
I know.
We'll see how that happens. See, Joe, and I don't know if I've mentioned this. It's okay if I mention our connection, right?
Oh, yeah. We have more than a connection besides velvet ants, right?
Yes.
We share a grandpa.
We do. We're cousins. And so we've known each other our whole lives. And Joe's a little younger than me, so I guess I've been around longer. But we've known each other our whole lives. And we have, ever since I started becoming interested in velvet ants, Joe's been a resource for me. And the first time I went to find some velvet ants, I texted him and said, "Hey, Joe, I'm looking for velvet ants. What can you help me with?" And he told me exactly where to look. And the first time I went to look, I followed all of his instructions and I found 3 in 20 minutes.
Oh, that's awesome.
So, and then I immediately sent him the pictures. Look what I got. Thank you.
I do remember it. Now I have a really big head about how to tell people about where to find velvet ants.
So yeah, it's awesome. And it's fun. We had I guess you could call it a geek out session. When was that? Like a month or so ago.
Yeah.
And it was so fun. He came over. We were all wearing masks, of course. And
yeah.
He came over and brought me a couple of velvet ants that he had collected a week or so before, which I love. They're the Dasimutilla gloriosa. I should show you that species.
Yeah, you should show a picture. My favorite species.
And it's swiftly becoming one of my favorites too. Let's see. Can you see it on the screen yet, or is it not working yet?
Oh, disappeared.
Disappeared. Okay, let me try again. I'm still figuring out how to share screens on this stuff. Oh, I think I know what I have to do. I have to open this in Photos first and then stop the share. Sorry, everybody. And then we'll get it again.
So while you're opening this picture, this species is called the thistledown velvet ant, Dasimutilla gloriosa. And so the velvet ant is white and really fluffy. Right next to it is the fruit of a creosote bush, also white and fluffy. People for a long time have said, oh, that velvet ant is camouflaged with these creosote fruits that blow around the desert. And we've thought that for the last 200 years. But me and my colleagues just published a paper that shows that actually the white fluffiness of the velvet ant probably is an adaptation to living in the hot deserts. It keeps it cool because of that white coloration. And these creosote bush actually have a slightly different color of white. And so lizards and birds that can see ultraviolet don't think that this velvet ant and this creosote seed look the same.
I thought that's absolutely fascinating. And you determined that partly from fossil evidence of the arrival of the creosote bush in the area, right?
Yeah, so we use fossil evidence to know when creosote bush got to North America, and then we use genetic evidence to infer how old this white velvet ant was evolutionarily. And so the velvet ant evolved about 5 million years ago, and creosote bush came to North America about 100,000 years ago. So there was this disconnect, which made us look into more things. So what we did is we measured the temperature of the velvet ant under a heat lamp, and we could see that it stayed cooler than related velvet ants that are orange and black.
But similarly fuzzy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I thought that was absolutely fascinating when we were talking about that. That is the coolest thing ever.
Yeah, they're awesome.
So let's see. It looks like Francisco Leon is asking, are there velvet ants in South America?
Oh, yes, there are. And they're much less studied than the North American species. One of my good friends, he's like the velvet ant master of the world. He lives in California now, but he spent a couple of years in Brazil studying velvet ants. And so there's a kind of a team of researchers in Brazil currently studying velvet ants. But there's also, I think, some in Panama that are studying velvet ants. But yeah, there's tons of different species. Many of them are in the dry areas, up like in kind of northeastern Brazil, but also, they're all over, mostly in the dry areas, but there are tropical adapted velvet ants. So in the Amazon basin, you'll get different species than you will down in the deserts. Cool.
Have you ever seen any blue species?
When you Google velvet ants, there is one that is a photoshopped, a pretty bad Photoshop version of, and it says it's a blue velvet ant, but there actually are in Southeast Asia, kind of in, so that Australia has a couple of them, and then some of those Southeast Asian islands, it's a metallic blue velvet ant species. I'll see if I can find a picture of it on my computer and I can share the screen while we talk, but it's really cool because it's metallic bluish purplish.
Cool. Does it have the traditional velvet?
No, it's actually the cuticle is metallic-y and it's not very hairy at all. So I'll see. I can't remember where I put those other pictures, but I'll look for it. Okay,
cool. Oh, and Licinius, while you're doing that, Licinius is asking, why did they evolve in the females to have no wings?
It's a good question. And so velvet ants are a pretty old family of wasps. They're at least 25 million years old. And they're not the only wingless wasp family. There are several other ones that have evolved this winglessness. But it's hard to say. It could have just been, so evolution is a tricky thing because sometimes there's selective pressure to evolve a certain characteristic. Other times it just happens, like it's kind of a random change. And maybe for velvet ants, that random change didn't negatively affect it because it wasn't using its wings much anyway, since it spends much of its time digging in the ground and wandering around. So it's hard to say, but because there's no benefit for the female of having wings, natural selection has allowed whatever caused the winglessness change. Natural selection has allowed that to maintain through this family because it didn't have a negative effect on it. If that makes sense.
Okay, so it's kind of it was a trait that it didn't really need. It didn't really need, and so it wasn't penalized in the evolution era.
Exactly. Yeah. So I hesitate as an evolutionary biologist. I try not to talk about it as, it didn't need it, so it lost it. If we watch the nature movies, we see the blind cavefish, and the narrator will say the blind cavefish didn't use its eyes, and so it lost them evolutionarily. And that's not really how it happens. It's more of random events happen, and there was some mutation that made it so it lost its wings, or maybe had shorter wings and didn't use them. And because that mutation didn't have a negative impact on it, it stayed.
Right, because there's always a metabolic cost to producing an organ, and so there's a slight benefit to losing it if you don't need it, right?
Exactly. And it's a mutation that we see sometimes. So male velvet ants do have wings, which we haven't really talked about. I think I sent you a picture of a male, did I?
You did. Let me see if I can pull that up.
So we should show that. So males have wings, but you see every once in a while a male that has some mutation that makes it so its wings are only about half size. And so that could tell us that maybe the development of wings is a pretty easy thing to gain or lose. So that's a normal male that'll show up in a second.
Yeah, I think I see what I did. Okay, I can share it. I'm still learning how this works, but I think I've got it now. Nope, I somehow closed it.
That's okay. I'm still trying to find my metallic velvet ant picture.
Okay, I think I have it open now. I hope. And oh yeah, now we got see this is the Gloriosa male, right?
Yeah, so that white fluffy one that we just saw, this is what the male looks like, which is also cool because then it shows that there's different natural selection pressures on the males and the females. This male looks like a lot of its close relatives, but the female doesn't look at all like its close relatives. It's white and fluffy. So, but yeah, most males have long wings like that.
Right. I've encountered, I think, male bioculata once or twice.
Yeah.
It's pretty rare that I've seen them.
And we don't see the males as often because they are once they've mated, they don't stick around for very long.
They just die. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Bugs in Cyberspace has joined in. Nice. Thanks for joining us, Peter. Let's see. So we got a lot of questions. So this is one for you. Does Joe specialize in velvet ants or Hymenoptera in general?
So I specialize mostly in bees and velvet ants, those two categories. Bees is what I've spent a lot of my recent research on, and velvet ants is what I started with my PhD and continued with. But so I do know some other Hymenoptera questions. I know the least about true ants, but I know quite a bit about a lot about bees, a lot about velvet ants, and some about other wasps.
Cool. Oh, here's a related question to what you just said. How closely related are velvet ants, paper wasps, solitary wasps, and true ants?
They are. So there's a recent family tree that someone has generated. Bees are just a kind of, actually, all of these are a kind of wasp. So it's kind of hard to think about it, but think about mammals. Mammals is a big category of animals. And within mammals, we have the dogs and their relatives, and the cats and their relatives, and the skunks and their relatives. And so we have different subcategories of mammals. And so if Hymenoptera is this big category, those are all officially wasps. And in that, we have ants, which are a specialist kind of wasp. We have bees, which are a specialist kind of wasp. And then we have a bunch of other kinds of wasps that are in there. So they're all closely related, but it's hard unless you're talking specifics.
Okay, so in general, they're all from the same order.
Yeah, they're all in the same order.
And anything in that order is technically a wasp, but then we
Yes.
have specializations within the group.
Yes, and you can even narrow that down further because there's two major categories of wasps: the stinging wasps and the parasitic wasps. Parasitic wasps lay their egg through their egg layer, their ovipositor. Stinging wasps sting through their ovipositor. So when we get stung, that is a modified egg-laying structure that they now push poison into you or venom into you. But there's a whole other group of wasps that use that to lay eggs, and they're all parasitic wasps.
Okay, cool. So Supreme Gecko is asking, what are the natural predators of velvet ants, and are the predators also immune to other stings as well? And I love this question because I've read your paper. So
oh, nice. It's a good question because we studied this for a couple of years, and my colleague wrote a paper, and the title was "Velvet Ants: The Indestructible Insect," because almost nothing eats them successfully. So we tried to feed them to lizards and to birds and to praying mantises and to shrews and to moles and to just tons of stuff. And so velvet ants are the coolest wasp in the world for 4 reasons. They're actually one of the highest, have the most defenses out of almost any bee, wasp, or ant. So first, they have a sting. And if you've ever watched the guy on YouTube, I can't remember his name, that gets stung by stuff.
Coyote Peterson, is that?
Coyote Peterson.
Yeah.
He gets stung by various things. Velvet ants are ranked among the highest in the pain index that this other guy did, Justin Schmid. They're not the highest, but they're among the highest. So they have a really painful sting. Their stinger is the longest stinger compared to their body out of any Hymenoptera. So it's almost like half the length of their body. Did I send you that video of the sting? It's like a velvet ant being held with tweezers.
I've seen pictures of it that you showed me pictures of it. I don't think I've seen the video.
I think I might have sent it in that folder that you were just sharing. But
I can check.
Yeah, let's see if it's there because it's really impressive. It's not just a long sting, but it's really agile. So they can like twist it around and curve it and sting you wherever you grab them. So they have a painful sting. They have a long stinger. They actually squeak as a defensive kind of a scare tactic. They can rub some of their abdominal segments together to squeak. They also have a really hard cuticle. It takes 11 times as much pressure to crush a velvet ant as it does to crush a honeybee. So they're like super armored. And their cuticle is really slippery. If you've worked in an insect collection and you try to pin a dead velvet ant, you often pin your finger because the pin slides right off.
Yep. My girls were with a group of people a couple of years ago, and there was a velvet ant in the room, and they were thinking, oh, our dad wants this, but somebody else in the room was like, no, kill it, and they slapped it with a piece of paper and nothing happened. It's totally fine. My
friend that I used to collect velvet ants with, because we would be walking around with backpacks on with our collecting gear in our backpacks, and if he would see one, he would say, oh, just step on it. So you could step on it in the dirt, and it would just push it into the dirt and not crush it at all, so we could take our backpack off and get our collecting equipment out and then lift our foot up and the velvet ant would run away. So they're super tough.
Cool. Oh, we got a super chat. Ken of the Kaiju Isu channel, Ken Malinsky says, more of these kinds of live streams, please. So awesome. He loves it. And thank you, Ken. I will try to do more of these because I'm really enjoying it. And I can see that you are all too. So awesome. So a couple more questions. I think we already answered, there aren't any colonial velvet ants and they don't raise their young. They just put their egg on an existing larva and take off, right?
Yes.
Correct? Okay. So Matt M says, do velvet ants die after they sting?
Oh, no, that's a good question. In fact, only honeybees die after they sting. So North America has 4,000 different kinds of honeybees. I mean, kind of bees. One of them is a honeybee. So most bees and wasps, including velvet ants, can sting you multiple times. Do you want me to try to share that video, velvet ant?
That would be awesome.
Let's see if I can find it. Velvet ant sting. If I open this, well, 1 second, my computer's thinking.
Okay.
Then I have to share the screen. Application window. Okay, can you guys see that?
Let me add it to the stream. There it is.
Okay, so I'm going to push play on this. I think I've slowed it down a little bit. This is me holding. This is Dasimutilla satanis, which is a cool name. And its sting is right here, just barely popping out. I don't know if you can see it, but anyway, here you go.
Yeah.
So you can see how long that is. And it's not just long, but it's like it has some kind of sensors on it. So it's feeling around. I've tried to extract the venom from velvet ants. So people do this with scorpions and with rattlesnakes. And I couldn't get the velvet ant to release any, I'll play it one more time, to release any venom until its sting felt like it was poking into something. So I had this little thin layer of wax and it would poke into the wax and then release some of that venom.
Oh, wow.
Super cool, long sting. I've never been stung by one, but I hear it's pretty painful.
Yes. I was stung as a kid. I was about 10. And I had a vague idea of what I was messing with, but also a lot of curiosity, and teased it too much. And first it stridulated, and then it stung me. And I still remember it.
See, I sometimes think, man, I should try to get stung just so I know. Because as a velvet ant researcher, how can I answer that question? But I just don't want to try it.
Yeah, it was nasty. And that was just a little Timula velvet ant. Like,
oh, yeah.
So I don't even know what a bigger one like a Desimutilla klugi or something or magnifica would do.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It would probably hurt, I would assume.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Don Waters says that he can say firsthand a velvet ant sting hurts. He also asks, what about dirt daubers or mud daubers? What category do they fall in?
So those are a wasp, too. They are a solitary wasp. Most of them actually hunt spiders. So they make little mud nests like inside your garage on the inside of the wall. And in that mud nest, they will catch and sting, which paralyzes several spiders, and they'll shove them into that nest, lay an egg on it, and then cover the nest in with mud. So then their baby hatches and eats the paralyzed spiders that were left for it. Super cool.
That is cool. So Nezogaster says, what predator would a velvet ant use its stinger on? We've already heard what...
Oh, yeah, so I didn't finish that story, I guess. So nothing can eat them, but what happens is, so with, actually, I shouldn't say nothing. Recent research that we're just working on shows that toads eat them more often than anything else. There was one of our trials that the toad ate a velvet ant, because toads don't chew anything up. They just swallow it whole, right? And so they swallowed the velvet ant whole. 20 minutes later, it regurgitated the velvet ant, and the velvet ant crawled away and was fine. So, but what often happens with lizards or birds is the lizard will bite the velvet ant, and because they're so hard, it can't crush it like it normally would. So it tries to manipulate it in its mouth. The velvet ant then stings the animal, the predator, the bird or the lizard in the mouth. The lizard releases the velvet ant, and it is exposed to three things. 1, the bright coloration of the velvet ant. 2, the squeaking sounds of the velvet ant. And 3, the pain that is in its mouth now from being stung. And so these lizards learn super fast not to eat another velvet ant. So we tried to feed a lizard a velvet ant. This was a whiptail lizard. It tried to eat it. It got stung in the mouth, and we kept that lizard for a year, feeding it mealworms and crickets and having a nice life. A year later, we introduced a new velvet ant to it, and it wouldn't even look at it. Like it just didn't even think of it as a potential prey. And this was, a lizard that had been in captivity for more than a year now. So every time we would go to the lid, it knew it was getting fed. So it would come over and wait for the food to get dropped in. As soon as the velvet ant got dropped in, it ignored it. So I don't know how, aware lizards are, but a year later to remember that the velvet ant is not good to eat, that was pretty impressive.
Yeah, after just one instance.
Yeah.
That long. Yeah, that's amazing.
And the other benefit of that is the velvet ant doesn't get harmed, so it can continue on with its life. We hear about like the monarch butterfly that tastes bad, but in order to teach a bird that it tastes bad, one of those monarchs has to get eaten.
Right. Yeah, good point. So Bugs in Cyberspace is asking about, are there cases where velvet ants have been reproduced in captivity? If so, how? I guess we already covered that earlier in the stream, so he'll be able to catch that. Let's see. Nezogaster asks, is the velvet ant stinger unique because it is a modified ovipositor, or is that a common occurrence for insects?
So it's not unique among the stinging wasps. And so almost everything we usually think of as a wasp has this modified ovipositor that is a stinger. All bees have that, most ants have that, and most wasps that we think of as wasps. The wasps that don't, so there's this wasp that comes out kind of in the summertime. It's about 3 inches long, and it has a really long, quote, stinger hanging out from it when it's flying around. Have you seen those?
I have seen those, yeah.
I have a picture of one I could share if I can find it. But those are a parasitic wasp, and so it's actually laying its eggs through that egg layer, the ovipositor. But most of the things we think of as wasps, like yellow jackets and hornets and spider wasps, they all have modified ovipositors.
So they're still ovipositors in that they're a functional egg-producing structure, but they're also a venom delivery system?
Well, it's actually slightly different. So they're only a venom delivery system. The egg is now laid out of a ovipore, which is kind of at the base of the sting.
Okay.
So they no longer lay eggs through it. It's just a venom delivery.
Cool.
Yeah, it's really cool.
I've been curious about that one. So, okay. So Matt M is asking, what kind of venom do velvet ants have? Is the venom produced similar across the order?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have extracted venom from several velvet ant species, but I don't have the capabilities at my campus here to do any chemistry analysis with it. So I sent it off to some colleagues and they got busy doing other things. So at this point, we know almost nothing about velvet ant venom chemistry, but it's a super cool avenue that hopefully I'll get into later in my career, because I would love to know what's in it.
Cool. And what little I know about it, that I'm sure you already know this, but I've heard that it's not very dangerous, just painful.
Yeah. So there has been some studies back in the 80s. So the guy who is now famous for getting stung by things and ranking it, Justin Schmid, he did some really cool work in the late 70s and early 80s. And so there's a LD50 is lethal dose 50. What does the 50 stand for? It's a way to measure how lethal different substances are, and they usually do it on mice. They inject this into mice and see how much it takes to kill a mouse. But he did that with velvet ant venom, and so it's super painful, but it's really not very toxic. So it's not very lethal, which is also kind of unique because most wasps use their venom to immobilize or paralyze their host. Velvet ant's host is a larva or pupa, so you don't really have to immobilize it. So its venom has evolved to be really painful, but not necessarily kill the host. I mean, and you don't want, if you're trying to avoid getting eaten by a lizard, you don't want to kill the lizard, because then you have not trained that lizard. You want to just make that lizard have a painful experience so it will remember not to eat you next time.
Right. So the most evolutionary leverage you get is by making sure everyone remembers how awful it was to be stung.
Exactly. Do you want me to share one of these parasitic wasp pictures that I have?
Yeah, that'd be cool.
I have one next to a quarter. I haven't edited this picture, but it'll still work. Let me find where my window went. Share. Okay, that is now sharing.
Okay, here it comes. Oh, is that an Newman wasp?
Yes, this is. And so that wasp you can see is like twice as big as a quarter, which it's sitting on. And then that thing coming out the back of it is its egg layer. It actually drills that down into dead pieces of wood to parasitize beetle larvae. But so that is a non-stinging wasp. That is just an egg layer, even though it looks like a big scary wasp with a long stinger.
But it can drill through wood with that thing.
It can drill through wood for that thing. It's really crazy.
Wow. Now I've encountered those. They're quite impressively sized.
Yeah, they're cool.
So Pie Dreadhawk asked, what do leafcutter bees hunt?
So leafcutter bees are, so what makes a bee instead of like the other wasps? Bees are all herbivores and wasps are primarily carnivores. So wasps are hunters of other bugs. Bees collect pollen. So leafcutter bees they're generalist pollinators, and so they collect pollen from many different sources. The pollen is their protein for their babies. But yeah, leafcutter bees are generalist, and so they do like sunflowers and flowers in the sunflower family, but they really will visit almost any kind of flower.
Cool. So Pup 314 says, do velvet ants have parasites?
So it's interesting because a velvet ant is a parasite, and so there is some records of hyperparasitism when a parasite parasitizes another parasite. So if a velvet ant gets parasitized, it will be a case of hyperparasitism. But there are these flies that will fly around the ground. They'll actually follow wasps or follow velvet ants. And when the velvet ant crawls into a bee nest to parasitize it, the fly then waits. And when the velvet ant comes out, it'll crawl in and it will parasitize the velvet ants. So the velvet ant parasitizes the bee and the fly parasitizes the velvet ant. But so that can happen, but it's not like a super common thing. Like parasitism among velvet ants is not one of the main factors in its livelihood. Okay,
cool. So Theropod Hunter asks, what are the best environments for velvet ants for a vivarium?
Oh, that's a good question. It depends on where you live. If you're in the eastern U.S., then you can make one that's similar to the eastern habitats. But most of the time, especially if you're using it for kind of display or for your own, observation, a sandy habitat with not a lot of other stuff is often nice. So in mine, when I do it, I have kind of sand, maybe with one little piece of wood or a rock or two. But they often like open. You find them most often in open soil areas. So even if you're in the east, the sandy areas like riverbanks and stuff is often where you find them. Even down in the tropics, you find them in more of the open areas most of the time, because that's where many bees and wasps will nest. But so in a vivarium, I would use kind of open sandy soil. Russ, yours looks awesome. I don't know if you've ever shared that one before. I've seen some videos recently, but from close up. But yeah, so sand with a couple of hideaway areas.
Cool. All right. So Heather Jensen says, we are constantly being told by our landlord that wasps don't return to old nests, but we have wasp nests too high to remove and wasp problems every year. So you think there's any validity to that landlord's assertion?
There is and there isn't. It can be a little bit of both. So the wasps that most people have problems with are paper wasps. They're the ones that make those honeycomb-looking nests up under your eaves. And as far as I know, they don't return to the old nests. Well, they do sometimes, I guess. Most of the time they don't. So these wasps have a yearly life cycle. Every year, all those worker wasps die, and the next year's queens go out and hibernate to start a new hive somewhere. But so most of the time they don't come, but there are enough wasps around that you'll get them year after year after year. And it's hard to, if you knock them down, you'll probably still get new nests popping up in your eaves the next year.
So maybe the queen wasps may return even though the workers are dead, so they can't.
Yeah, but they don't like the big paper mache looking bags that you see hanging from trees. I have one right over there. I should grab it. But those ones they don't return to. But sometimes those ones that are under your eaves that look like a honeycomb, they will occasionally start it over, but usually they just start fresh every year. So your landlord is mostly right.
Okay. So Confite asks if there are any velvet ant fossils. What's their fossil record like?
Yeah, it's very limited. Most of the fossils of velvet ants are from amber. And so there's a couple different amber deposits that you can get them from, but most of them are not that old, like not dinosaur era fossils. There are several velvet ant fossils from Dominican amber, which I believe is like 20 million years old. But yeah, so there are some velvet ant fossils, but they're pretty limited. They're cool though.
Okay, cool. So if someone is allergic, Cody Dryden Conway is asking, if someone's allergic to bee stings, is it likely they would be allergic to velvet ant stings?
It's almost, we don't know enough to answer it, but even among bees, most people, when they're allergic to bee stings, they're allergic to honeybees. And it depends on the severity of the allergy, but often if someone is allergic to honeybees, they might not be allergic to some of the other native bees like sweat bees. And so it just depends on the severity of the allergy, but we don't really know. I have never heard of anyone having an allergic reaction to a velvet ant sting, but not that many people are fortunate enough to be stung by a velvet ant.
Yeah.
or unfortunate,
Or unfortunate. So Bugs in Cyberspace is asking, what do velvet ants eat in the wild, and why are the mandibles so formidable?
Oh yeah, the mandibles are kind of tricky looking. And in fact, there's a lot of the species level identification, especially for the nocturnal species, that are related to the mandible, how many teeth they have or different angles and stuff. They probably use their mandibles mostly to dig. In the wild, they're parasitic. So as adults, they eat two things, as far as the literature says. One is they will sometimes wound their host, like bite their host and drink the hemolymph, which is like their blood. So they might be drinking some blood. So their mandibles could be used to pierce the host larva, and they drink nectar sometimes. They'll be on flowers drinking nectar. But the mandibles are probably mostly for digging. A lot of times they're digging into nests they're already completed for the season. So these nests have already been packed in with dirt, and so those mandibles can be used to chip away at the hard-packed soil.
It makes a lot of sense.
You can actually kind of judge the age of a velvet ant by how worn down its mandibles are. So a freshly emerged velvet ant will have nice full mandibles with kind of sharp teeth at the end. An older specimen will sometimes just have blunt nubs for the mandibles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
It is cool.
So let's see. Jarek Dyer is asking if Does the velvet ant's protections affect its behavior when acting in a group compared to other ant species?
So velvet ants don't act in a group, actually. Even if they're found by each other, they just basically ignore each other. So I've had several velvet ants together in my vivarium, and they just kind of crawl around each other. Every once in a while, they'll get in a little kind of a fight when they kind of bite each other with their mandibles. It doesn't do any real damage, but in the wild, there's not any real interaction. So their defenses are purely independent. They're solitary defenses.
So,
but can I say a but there?
Yeah.
So, but because if you are dangerous in nature, it benefits you to look like other dangerous things. So the predators learn that things are dangerous. And so this could be a segue into a slight discussion about mimicry. So velvet ants are part of this big mimicry system. So if you live in southern Mexico or in Central America, the velvet ants look a certain way. They're black with kind of white and yellow spots. If you live in the Mojave Desert, several of the velvet ants look like this one on the screen. They're kind of white and fluffy. If you live farther north into Utah and Idaho, they're going to be orange and fluffy. If you live in the eastern US, they're mostly bald and red. And so they have evolved these different color patterns in different areas. And so that's part of their defenses, is they have mimicked each other in an area, so then you train predators really quickly. It's called Mullerian mimicry.
It's very cool. Now, let's see. Pup314 asks, could a Gila monster with its powerful jaws eat velvet ants?
So Gila monsters, it's weird because they're venomous and they have those strong jaws, but their main prey is like eggs and babies of other things. So it's not like they're really using them to crush stuff. I mean, because the eggs they're eating are like tortoise eggs and things, right? But so no one's ever tested it with a Gila monster, and I don't think it usually hunts insects anyway. But someone has tested it with a big-headed skink, which has pretty powerful jaws. And the big-headed skink, I can't remember how many trials. They tried to feed like 50 different velvet ants to 50 different lizards or something like that. And most of them were unable to bite through the velvet ant. One was able to bite the abdomen away from the thorax because of that little junction there. But in general, most of them were unsuccessful. So even the pretty strong-jawed lizards out there aren't very successful at it.
Some trouble with it. Wow.
Yeah.
So Nezogaster's asking, what role do velvet ants serve in their various ecosystems? And we know a little bit about the parasitism of the other wasps and so on, but what else do they do in the ecosystem?
It's mainly a parasitic role. And so parasites, we think of them as really negative. But what happens is if there is a host, like let's say there's a wasp that becomes really abundant in an area. One way that kind of the checks and balances in nature is parasites. Parasites usually parasitize the most abundant things in the area. So as a certain wasp or a certain bee gets more abundant, the velvet ants will kind of keep that in check by parasitizing those nests. And so it doesn't play, as far as a positive role in the environment, parasitism is a positive role because it maintains the balance. It helps maintain biodiversity in an ecosystem.
Okay.
I mean, they might also serve as pollinators very slightly when they're crawling around on a flower to drink nectar. They might accidentally transfer some pollen, but it's not a major role that they will play.
Okay. Oh, that makes sense. Are the velvet ants in the fossil record larger than their common day ancestors? From Heather Jensen.
Oh, that's a good question. And in fact, I mean, it is a really limited fossil record, but they're all pretty small. And even currently, the largest velvet ants we have around are maybe 3/4 of an inch long, and the smallest ones are like 2 millimeters. And so the fossils fit within the current range of velvet ant sizes.
Cool. So what makes their shells so hard, chemically speaking, from confight, and how often do they molt, if at all?
They never do molt. So velvet ants are holometabolists. They go through complete metamorphosis, similar to like a butterfly. The larva looks totally different than the adult. So a larval velvet ant will look like a maggot. As soon as it pupates and emerges as an adult, it never molts. What makes its cuticle so hard is partly the thickness. It's pretty thick. But one unique aspect of velvet ants compared to other wasps is their thorax is one complete shell, basically. Most wasps have lots of junctions and grooves because the wing muscles have to attach, and there has to be some flexibility in order for flight to be effective. But female velvet ants, the thorax is just a completely fused covering, make it more, armor-like. And then also on the abdomen, instead of having equally spaced segments on the abdomen, you can see in this picture that one segment there takes up more than half of the abdomen. So it's this really hard kind of armored shell there. But so the two things that make it really tough is it's thick and it's kind of fused together, more so than most wasps.
Okay, cool. So Bugs in Cyberspace is asking, what's the advantage of being covered in CT or setae or however you say that?
I say CT, and that's very astute because I always say hairs, but velvet ants don't really have hairs. Hairs are a mammal characteristic, and so all the true velvet ant geeks, push my glasses up, call them CT or setae. But we're not sure what advantage. Well, there are several potential advantages. One is the CD are generally what are showing this coloration, the aposematic coloration, meaning warning colors. That's usually the differences in the sedal color that provides this contrasting pattern. You can see in this species here, the yellow and the black and the red and the white make this really contrasting pattern that warns predators that it's dangerous. So that's one benefit of having these CD. Another one might be, and this is all theoretical at this point because we haven't done the research, but it might help them stay cool in hot environments. Part of our hypothesis for this is because tropical species and eastern species, where there's more foliage, they have shorter hairs than western species, which usually have less vegetation cover and more solar radiation hitting them. So we think the hairs could serve as kind of a thermoregulatory, help them stay cool, but a lot of it has to do with this coloration. Some people have also hypothesized that because they're digging underground into the nest, that the hairs, which are often facing backward, the hairs might help them in digging because it kind of keeps that dirt that they're pushing behind them, keeps it away from their digging appendages. But we don't know.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I love that. So great question, Peter, from Bugs in Cyberspace. Let's see. iBugman is asking how he can tell which genus his velvet ant is, and I can chime in a little bit here because he sent me 4 velvet ants that you, Joe, identified for me.
Oh yeah,
Dasymatilla vestita. So in a specific case, he's probably talking about those. But can you help us answer that in a general sense for everybody?
Yeah. So velvet ants are not easy to identify. Kevin Williams, who is a good friend of mine, he's like this velvet ant guru, and he can identify them from pictures most of the time. There are several genera. Well, it depends on where you live. So in the United States, for example, there are several genera. The easiest way to identify them is kind of by default. If it's out in the daytime and it's bright and hairy, it's most likely Dasymatilla. But the identifying characteristics are often the shape of the head, the shape of the thorax, the way the abdomen connects to the thorax. Is it a skinny little petiole or is it wider? But there's not really a good, easy answer to that. Me and some colleagues, we are working on a velvet ant field guide, but we are probably still 1.5 years or 2 years away from that coming out. And we'll have keys in there and tips for identifying it, but it's not that easy. iNaturalist, though, if you ever use iNaturalist, you can upload pictures onto it, and experts like my friend Kevin will identify it for you. But yeah, there's not a really good, easy way to answer that question.
Okay, but iNaturalist is a great resource.
Yeah, iNaturalist is awesome.
So Brian Orr is asking, since male velvet ants have wings, will they then travel to mate with multiple females?
Yes, usually they will. And it even differs in females. Some females will mate once and then they're done. Some females will mate multiple times, but often in Hymenoptera in general, the males emerge first, maybe a week or more before the females, and the males will then disperse from their natal nest, and then the females will come out afterwards. So males, you'll see flying kind of low across the ground, and they fly in these kind of zigzagged patterns, and they're probably honing in on some pheromones that the female's releasing. And as soon as the female mates, she stops releasing the pheromone, and the male flies off to find more. But the male's only job in life is to find females to mate with, and he will try to mate with as many as he can find.
Do the males actually eat?
They probably just drink nectar.
Okay.
Probably.
And Bugs in Cyberspace is asking how many hundreds of species in the U.S.?
So there's about 300 species in the U.S., but half of those are nocturnal. That most people aren't even aware that there are nocturnal velvet ants. So there, you could say about 150 bright fuzzy velvet ants in the U.S. But it's tricky because every time we look at these genetically, we find that what we thought was a species isn't. And most of the time with velvet ants, surprisingly, is you get multiple different colored things that were each named their own species, and genetically it turns out they're all the same thing. They just have a lot of variation in colors. So for example, Dasimutilla biaculata, which is one of the common ones across the West, it's the one that Russ finds by his house, I find it by my house. It also lives in Florida and Texas and all over the place. But in Texas, it looks totally different than it does in Florida, and which looks totally different than it does here in the West. So yeah, but the nocturnal velvet ants aren't bright. Most of them are not bright. Some of them are kind of hairy, but they're basically just brown. I'll find a picture and share it. Cool. But we can go to the next next question if you want to.
Okay. So Confite asks, do certain velvet ants parasitize ants?
No, that's a good question. Not that I know of. I don't think there's any ant parasites that are velvet ants. There are some velvet ants that will parasitize like honeybees. There's a species in Europe that parasitizes honeybees, and maybe bumblebees, but most of them parasitize solitary Hymenoptera. So I'm going to try to share the screen.
Okay.
Let's see. Can I share two windows at the same time? I'll do one at a time.
I can try.
So is that one showing up?
Yep.
That's a male nocturnal velvet ant. Males are attracted to porch lights and to black lights, and so you mostly see the males if you're ever looking. They look kind of like, I don't know, like ants a little bit, but you can see there's still some of that hairiness. So I'm going to close that one, and now I'll share the female nocturnal velvet ant. It looks like a boring velvet ant, kind of.
Let's see if I can pull that up. There it is.
There you go. So that's a female nocturnal velvet ant.
Subdued in coloration compared to some of the daytime ones.
Very much. And you can still see that thorax, which is one fused plate. You see the hairiness of it. But yeah, there's not a lot of color in these ones, in the nocturnal ones. But so about 150 nocturnal species, about 150 diurnal species.
Okay, awesome. So let's see. It looks like you pretty much covered the life cycle of velvet ants, haven't you?
I think so.
Up near the beginning, we talked.
Yeah, we talked about it basically.
Some people are asking, so you can go back and watch the replay and catch that. So Crystal, okay, we talked about velvet ants are true wasps, but ants are also wasps, they're just like a subgroup. But velvet ants are more closely related to stinging wasps than they are to ants. Right?
Yeah, ants are a different family. Velvet ants are more closely related to spider wasps, like the tarantula hawk, if you're familiar with that one. But yeah, they're not very closely related to ants at all. They just happen to look similar.
Okay. So do they have a big effect on the hives that they parasitize, is Matt M's question.
So if they're parasitizing, so like for the honeybee hives, I assume maybe Matt's asking about. In Europe, there's no honeybee parasitic velvet ants in North or South America that I know of, but a native species in Europe does parasitize them, but it's not a huge threat to honeybees, if that's the question. So they don't have a big effect. They can have on the solitary bees they parasitize. They can have a pretty big ecological effect, like with 50% of the larval nest cells being parasitized by velvet ants.
Okay, cool. Let's see. So another question. What do the young look like compared to the adults?
They look like a maggot. In fact, all bees, wasps, and ants, the young look like a little kind of grub-looking wormy maggot.
Okay. So I put a little video up here. I wanted to see if it would work. You can see in the center of the screen my Dasimutilla nocturna that Peter and Bugs in Cyberspace sent me. And then there are a couple of Gloriosa, Dasimutilla gloriosa, that you, Joe, brought to me. And I just put the camera on them and let them go for a while. They're really super active. I've noticed that these two species are much more active in the daytime than my Dasimutilla vestita. They usually come out in the evening hours. They're still during, when it's light. but in the evening hours, whereas these gals are active all day, which is really interesting. Okay, Bugs and Cybersource asked about the lifespan of males versus females. I guess we kind of talked about that. Can you touch on that briefly?
Yeah, I'll just briefly say females can live between a month to a year generally. The males only live a couple weeks.
Okay. And then are there velvet ants? You kind of talked about their parasitism. Sorry, I'm choking on that word. Are there generalist velvet ants that will parasitize?
Yeah. So in fact, we don't know a lot about the hosts for most species, but the few data points that we have, it looks like many velvet ants are pretty generalist. There's one nocturnal species that has been reared off of like 30 different wasps. So it parasitizes 30 different things. This Dasyamutilla gloriosa in your video here, we think it mostly parasitizes sand wasps. So it's a little bit more specific. But it's kind of interesting because most parasitic wasps are kind of host specific. Velvet ant seems to be more opportunistic.
Oh, cool. So what are the main seasonal variations in behavior and resting periods for velvet ants from Bugs in Cyberspace?
Yes, so most velvet ants have a pretty narrow window of activity as an adult. Most of them come out in the late summer and are active for a couple months, August, September, maybe parts of July. And then the rest of that's it for the adults. And then the rest of their life is larvae being spent underground. So there are some exceptions to that. There are a few species like Dasyamutilla vestita. Do you have that one, Russ?
I do. I've got 4 of those.
Yeah. So those ones are more long-lived. They're quite flexible. I found vestita from like 10,000 feet up in the mountains down to 100 feet down by sea level, and I've seen them from April through October. So, but most species are out right now, this late summer. Right,
and this seems to be with the vestita too. I've noticed they seem to be a long-lived one, right?
Yeah, they do. I've had vestita alive in my lab for, I think it was like 14 months. It's tricky because sometimes like over Christmas break, I don't keep them very well in my lab because I'm not at my campus, but I've had them alive for more than a year in the lab.
Yeah, my oldest velvet ant that I have right now is a vestita, and I caught her last summer, so she's
nice.
Old now. So
that's awesome.
Let's see. What is your favorite velvet ant, Joe?
My favorite is Dasyamutilla gloriosa, that white fluffy one in that video there. I just think they look awesome.
Oh, I love those too. They're so
cool. They're cool. But it's really hard because so many velvet ants are cool looking.
I'm going to see if I can share the screen and show that gloriosa again. Well, I can just do this and show show the video again. I broke it. What did I do? Okay, let me see if that is it working now? Is the video actually running?
Nope, I don't see any movement.
Oh, there it goes.
Oh, now it goes.
Yeah. So gloriosa are these amazingly, fantastically fuzzy white ones that look like they're wearing a tutu, kind of.
Yeah, it's really long. They have the longest hair or longest CD compared to their body out of any velvet ant.
Cool. Let's see. How far north or south can velvet ants be found? Matt M. asked.
So there are a few species that can be found in southern Canada, some up in Russia, in some of those cold desert areas. South, they can be found, all the way down into Argentina and Chile, and Australia has several species, but definitely they are limited both elevationally and in latitude by the colder weather. So you don't get very many up into Canada. There's just a few species. But yeah, they're pretty widespread on all the continents, but Antarctica, lots of different adaptations.
Okay, awesome. They're just amazing. I am continually fascinated by anything related to velvet ants.
Yeah. So, I did notice one question that I skipped over. It's, do they have any relationship to robber flies? And someone asked if a robber fly could eat one. So I've never seen a robber fly that has preyed on a velvet ant. So robber flies have this really sharp kind of beak that they pierce their prey and immobilize it very quickly. I've never seen one with a velvet ant. I doubt it could actually pierce through the velvet ant. I did try to feed a velvet ant to a mantis mantises are pretty good predators, and the mantis did grab the velvet ant, was trying to bite it and couldn't until it finally got stung and released it.
Okay. So what is the biggest or strongest velvet ant?
Biggest or strongest? So some of the biggest species, there's several big species. In South America, there's a genus called Traumatomutilla, and they're pretty large, 3/4 of an inch. In North America and Mexico, Dasyamutilla is large, but so I'm most familiar with North American. So Dasyamutilla klugii, Dasyamutilla magnifica, Dasyamutilla occidentalis are all really closely related, very large species. I think I sent you a picture of Dasyamutilla occidentalis or magnifica, maybe.
Yeah, let me see if I can pull that up. I have magnifica here, so I'll pull that up. Let's see. I'm going to share the magnifica one here. I think that's it. Yeah, there it goes.
I should grab a ruler and I can see how big these are. So these would be almost an inch long. A magnifica is kind of specific to the Mojave Desert, so Southern California, parts of Utah, Nevada, and Arizona, but it's a really pretty species.
Oh, indeed, they are. I had a klugii that Peter at Bugs in Cyberspace sent me for quite a while. It lived for a long time. Not quite a year, but I think it was close.
Yeah, klugii is another pretty widespread one. So this color pattern you see in this magnifica, it's most common in Texas, kind of the Chihuahuan Desert area. But there are a few species like Dasyamutilla klugii that have this Texan color pattern, but they get all the way up into Idaho. So they're more widespread.
Cool. So do the adults hibernate in the winter? Bugs in Cyberspace is asking what they're doing during when they disappear and they're off season, because he's saying in captivity people have them over a year.
Yeah,
they're active all day, all the time. So what are they doing in the wild at that point?
No, it's a good question, and we don't know a lot about it. They probably do hibernate. They dig down maybe into a host's nest, or they could just dig their own like little tunnel and just go into a diapause in the colder seasons, and then come back out in the next year. I have collected a Dasyamutilla vestita, that really long-lived one. Actually, I should show you the picture of it because it's really fascinating. Yeah, I collected it during the normal velvet ant season, but it was almost hairless because the more they're digging, the more hairs get rubbed off. Right. And so this one was one that was apparently pretty old. Let me see if I can find it. I have lots of pictures of these because they're common in where I live. But okay, I'm gonna open this and share the screen with you. Too many buttons to click to share a screen. So yeah. This is how I collected this one. As you can see, it's almost completely hairless. So this one probably had overwintered at least one season. This was down in New Mexico, but yeah. So I'm guessing that they just are hibernating or in some kind of a diapause underground until the next year.
Wow, I've never seen one so very nearly bald.
No, me either. And it was walking around seemingly healthy. Like it wasn't, you know how sometimes older insects will not act very healthy? This one seemed normal.
Perfectly fine. Wow, that's interesting. So Newt's Commander is asking if velvet ants are a monophyletic group, and if so, are there species of velvet ants without the fluffiness?
Yes and yes. So it is a monophyletic group, meaning they all evolved from one ancestor. There is a closely related, some people, this group of wasps, some people consider them velvet ants. I personally consider them a close relative of velvet ants. They don't have that fused thorax, even though they are wingless. Myrmocidae is what I consider them. They're their own family. But yeah, they're a monophyletic group, and there are several. Well, let's see. Almost all velvet ants have some hair on them. A synapomorphy, which is a defining characteristic of the group, would be that they actually have branched hairs. They have hairs that have like little branches off of them. The plumocidae is what we call it. Bees have that, and that's a defining characteristic of bees. But velvet ants also have that. And so even the ones that are mostly hairless still have some hair on them. So there's none that are completely bald. They'll have like a thin covering of hair. Let me share another picture of an example of one that's more hairless. This is Dasyamutilla vesta, which has the coloration. Let me open it and I'll show you. It has the coloration of many eastern species. Let's see, share screen. But Dasyamutilla vesta is actually found from Florida all the way into Nevada.
Here it is.
Is that one on there? So you can see that it's kind of less hair on it, but at those fringes of the abdominal segments, you can still see those white kind of fluffy hairs. Those are those
the plumose
hairs. Yep.
Yeah. Cool. So, how soft are the CD of velvet ants?
Oh, they're pretty soft, kind of silky feeling.
Really?
Yeah. So they're not like bristly at all.
Cool. I've had velvet ants, not on purpose, since I was a kid, but as an adult, I've had them walk across my hands a couple of times.
Yeah.
And never actually touched, their CD, but I was curious about it.
Yeah, I've only mostly touched the dead ones. I was trying to see if I have any pinned specimens here, but yeah, they're pretty soft.
Cool. So Cody Dryden Conway asking, where could he go to catch velvet ants, and what could he catch in Washington State?
So Washington State is trickier because the farther north, you don't get as many. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, like west of the Cascades, it will be harder to find. If you go on the east side of Washington where it's drier, I would look for sandy areas this time of year, and I would just walk around kind of on the sandy soils in the evening, after 6 o'clock at night, and just watch for them crawling around.
Cool. So Thoroughpods asks, are there any completely black velvet ants?
Yes, there are, and it's interesting. They're mostly in the tropical areas. Most tropical velvet ants are black with some white spots, but there are a few species that are entirely black. There's also there's many of the male velvet ants in the tropics are just completely black, and the females have the kind of the bright contrasting colors, but there are a few species that are mostly black, one or two that I can think of.
Cool.
And so you might not recognize them as velvet ants.
As velvet ants.
Yeah.
At first glance, it just looks like a large black ant or something.
Yeah, and then you look closer and you see some of those characteristics like the fused thorax and stuff like that.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm looking at the clock and thinking, I wish we had 7 more hours to talk about this, because I could easily do that.
I know, we should. We could do it again sometime too, though.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. We got to do it again. I really want to thank you, Joe, for joining in. And if you'll hang out for just a minute, I'm going to end the broadcast before we end our conversation. We'll stay on for just a second.
Yeah.
But I wanted to thank everybody for joining in. We had some great participation, great questions. A lot of people in the stream today. We really appreciate it. I was happy to let the stream go a little longer because we just kept coming up with these great questions, and Joe kept coming up with great information. I learned a lot and really enjoyed it. So thanks, everybody. And I have a really cool video coming out on Friday, some really cool news that a lot of you have been waiting for a long time. So stay tuned and catch you on Friday.